My name is Eleanor Price, and 6 months after I buried my husband, my son looked me straight in the eye and told me he had sold Frank's Rolex. He said it with the same casual tone he used when announcing he was running late for dinner. I was standing at the kitchen sink, water still running, when the words landed. "It's already gone, Mom," he said, biting into an apple like he'd earned it. "Don't make a big deal. It was just a watch." The faucet dripped. The refrigerator hummed. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked on, steady and loyal, as if the world had not shifted. I stared at him, waiting for a laugh, a smirk, some sign this was a joke told in bad taste. Instead, he leaned against the counter, chewing, indifferent. That watch had been on Frank's wrist the night we danced in our first apartment, the night our daughter was born, the night we signed the mortgage papers on this house. When the cancer came, he refused to take it off, even in the hospital. He used to tell me, half serious, half tender, that if the watch kept ticking, so would he. After the funeral, I couldn't bring myself to wear it. I kept it in the top drawer beside the folded sympathy cards, a small piece of him I wasn't ready to carry but couldn't bear to lose. "You sold your father's watch?" I whispered. My voice shook so badly I barely recognized it. "Yeah," he said, rolling his shoulders, as if I were the unreasonable one. "Ashley found this amazing deal online for a resort. We deserve a break. You can always buy another Rolex someday." Another. As if decades of anniversaries, hospital hallways, and late-night whispers could be replaced with a receipt from a jewelry store. As if the last thing Frank ever wore before they lowered him into the ground was interchangeable with anything else. My son, my only son, had traded his father's legacy for plane tickets and margaritas. I wanted to scream, to slam the drawer where the watch had lived, to shout Frank's name until the walls remembered him, but instead, I stood frozen, soap bubbles sliding down the sink, listening to my son crunch another bite. Then he reached for my car keys on the hook by the door. "Relax, Mom. It's not like Dad needs it anymore." The words cracked something in me that had been holding steady through grief and long nights. For the first time since the funeral, I felt anger stronger than sorrow, hot and sharp. If Frank had been here, he would have placed a steady hand on my shoulder and said, "Easy does it, Elle." But Frank wasn't here. It was just me, in a kitchen that suddenly felt unfamiliar, facing a boy who once clutched my hand in movie theaters and now looked at me like a pawn ticket was more valuable than memory. And in that moment, I knew the watch wasn't gone. Not really. Frank was too deliberate, too careful. If Liam thought he had sold everything his father left behind, he had no idea what was ticking beneath the surface. When the front door finally shut behind them the next morning, the house seemed to exhale. Liam kissed the air near my cheek on his way out, the kind of kiss that avoids contact, and Ashley called over her shoulder to remind me to keep the thermostat at 70 for the dog's sake. Their suitcases rolled across the porch with cheerful clunks, and then the silence spread through every hallway like fog. I made tea I didn't drink. I set out breakfast and scraped it into the trash. Every room reminded me of something I had lost: the watch, Frank, the sense that family meant protection rather than exploitation. I drifted to the bedroom and opened the drawer where the Rolex had been. Empty space can make more noise than any object. I pressed my hand flat inside, half expecting to feel the cold shape of the watch still lingering like a phantom limb. Ashley's laughter floated back in my memory from the night before, her voice bragging on speakerphone about the resort's poolside bar. She had called me the old woman when she thought I wasn't listening, and Liam hadn't corrected her. It was a strange kind of widowhood, grieving the man who had gone and the boy who had changed, all at once. That afternoon, I dialed the pawn shop number I had scribbled from the credit card statement. The man who answered had a voice like gravel smoothed by water. When I described the Rolex, he paused long enough for my heart to ache, then told me to come by. "We need to talk in person," he said. Maple Avenue smelled of exhaust and cheap pizza. The pawn shop sat between a nail salon and a vacant storefront, its windows crowded with guitars and rings that had once meant promises. A bell chimed when I opened the door, and behind the counter stood a man younger than his voice, maybe mid-30s, with a beard and a compass tattoo curling down his forearm. He looked at me carefully, not with suspicion, but with the sympathy of someone who had seen too many last treasures handed over. "Mrs. Price?" he asked. I nodded, throat too tight to manage words. He explained that the Rolex had been sold almost immediately. "It's gone," he said, and the words felt final. But then he reached into a drawer and pulled out a small envelope. This was hidden in the box, taped under the liner. The young man who brought it in didn't notice. "I thought you might want it." My fingers trembled as he slid the envelope across the counter. My name was written on it in Frank's blocky handwriting. I hadn't seen those letters in half a year, and they cut through me more sharply than any loss of metal or diamonds. The clerk didn't try to comfort me with words like chill or move on. He simply nodded and said, "No charge." When I asked about a fee, his eyes held the kind of respect that told me he understood this was more than paper. I carried the envelope to my car like it was made of glass. For a long time, I couldn't open it. I just sat in the driver's seat, watching people cross the street with grocery bags, living their lives without knowing that mine was splitting open again. At last, I slipped a finger under the flap. Inside lay a single index card with numbers written in 2 neat columns and a small silver key taped to the bottom. Above the numbers, Frank had printed one word, Halcyon. My breath caught at the sight of his steady hand, the deliberate way he pressed letters into permanence. I held the key in my palm, its weight absurd for something so small. Frank had left me something more than memory. Whatever Halcyon meant, it was a thread leading out of the fog, and I was going to follow it. I drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat, as if it were a companion. When I stepped back into the empty house, I tucked it into the drawer where the Rolex had once rested, sealing old space with new purpose. For the first time since Liam had confessed, I felt something other than grief. I felt suspicion, and underneath it, a spark of resolve. And in that spark, I heard Frank's voice again, easy does it, L, one step at a time. The envelope sat on the table beside my reading lamp for 2 days before I found the courage to study it again. Morning light poured across the index card, making the ink look fresher than it should. 2 neat columns of numbers, a word above them, Halcyon, and that tiny silver key, taped so carefully it felt ceremonial. I typed the word into my laptop, half afraid of what I'd find. Halcyon was many things, a credit union, a mailbox service, even a marina upstate. None of them explained why Frank had chosen it as the heading of his secret. I dialed the credit union first. The clerk chirped through the line, asking for an account number I didn't have, and suggested I visit in person with proper ID. I thanked her and hung up, staring at the numbers again. The next day, I tried another lead. In the bottom of our file cabinet, I discovered a folder Frank had labeled Legacy. It held insurance forms, copies of our will, and, at the very back, a receipt from a place I'd never heard of, Riverstone Trust. The numbers on the receipt matched the first column on Frank's card almost exactly. My pulse jumped. I drove to the city with both hands steady on the wheel. Riverstone Trust looked like the sort of place where people whispered instead of spoke. a lobby hushed by thick carpet and money. When I gave my name, the receptionist's expression sharpened. Moments later, a woman in pearls escorted me to a small office. I placed the card on her desk like evidence in a trial. She studied it, tapped a few keys, then called for a compliance officer. The older woman who entered explained gently that my husband had rented a safe deposit box 3 years earlier. Access required the card, the key, and proof that I was listed in the will. I had all three. The vault smelled like metal and polish, timeless and secret. When the officer turned her lock, I fit Frank's small silver key into the other, my hands trembling. With a soft click, the drawer slid free. Inside was a manila envelope labeled Halcyon. I signed the necessary papers, then sat at a narrow desk, alone, with the envelope before me. My breath came shallow. The letter on top was written in Frank's careful print. He apologized for keeping secrets, then explained that he had grown worried about Liam, about the debts, the friends with rough eyes, and Ashley's influence. "Love isn't always enough to keep a man honest," he wrote. "Sometimes love needs help." Beneath the letter were account statements, municipal bonds, real estate investments, nothing flashy, but far more than I expected. Then came photocopies of messages between Liam and Ashley, discussions about credit, casinos, and a plan to have me declared incompetent to manage the estate. The words blurred until I pressed my hand hard against the desk to steady myself. At the bottom of the envelope lay a flash drive, taped to another index card. On it, Frank explained, was documentation from a private investigator named Lawson. He urged me to contact him if anything happened that made me doubt my safety or control over our home. I sat there for a long time, the hum of the vault surrounding me, tears sliding silently down my cheeks. Frank had known. He had seen the storm gathering and left me not just memories, but shelter. When I finally rose, I slipped the flash drive into my pocket, thanked the officer, and walked out into the bright city afternoon. The sun felt different, sharper, as if the world had shifted again. I wasn't just a widow fumbling through grief anymore. I was a woman holding a map my husband had drawn in secret, and I was ready to follow it. Lawson's office was tucked above a barber shop whose window still displayed haircuts from a decade ago. The hallway smelled of talc and old coffee. I liked it immediately, plain, no frills, the kind of place where truth didn't have to wear a suit. He opened the door before I knocked twice. Older than his voice on the phone, 60s maybe, with weathered hands and eyes that had learned patience. He poured me coffee in a chipped mug and warned it was terrible. I smiled for the first time in days. We sat by the window while he laid out the envelope's contents like surgical instruments, each in its place. Nothing wasted. Frank had hired him after the first round of chemo. Lawson explained. He hadn't wanted to believe his son was gambling, but evidence piled up. Markers at casinos, late-night cash withdrawals, photographs of Liam with men who didn't look like friends. There were recordings, too. Ashley's voice in my own kitchen, telling a friend I was slipping and that it would be best if they took over the finances before I embarrassed myself. I listened, my fingers tight around the mug, the bitterness of the coffee steadying me. "I don't want revenge," I said at last. "I just want to live in my own house without fear." "That's not revenge," Lawson replied. "That's protection." He suggested a plan. Let Liam and Ashley reveal themselves and be ready when they did. A lawyer he trusted, Miss Patel, specialized in elder law. She could prepare protective orders, update locks and passwords, and file responses if they tried a court petition. All we needed was the right moment. That night, I created the moment. I called Liam and invited him to dinner, promised the roast he'd loved as a boy. I set the table with good napkins, the kind I usually saved for holidays, and slipped the flash drive into my pocket like a hidden weapon. They arrived smelling of perfume and cheap wine. Ashley took off her coat and immediately scanned the mantel, touching frames like she was rearranging the future. Liam carried a bottle he hadn't paid for and set it down with a flourish, over roast and potatoes. We spoke of weather, neighbors, anything but truth. Then Liam leaned forward. "Have you thought more about putting the house in my name? Just for taxes." "Of course." Ashley chimed in smoothly. "Transitions are easier when handled early. We only want what's best for you." I placed my fork down and looked at them evenly. "I went to the bank today. Learned some things." The silence that followed was sharp. Liam's eyes narrowed. "What things?" "Enough," I said, "to know I'll be managing my own affairs, and enough to know you won't be selling anything else that belongs to me." Before they could answer, the doorbell rang, polite, steady. Lawson stepped in with Mizai Patel and a uniformed officer. They carried folders, not weapons, but I saw the effect was the same. Patel greeted me warmly, then placed documents on the table, protective orders, account updates, medical letters affirming my competence. Liam's chair screeched against the floor. "What is this?" he demanded. "This, Miss," Patel said calmly, "is your mother exercising her rights." Ashley tried a smile. "We were only considering options." "Then consider this one," I said. "I am not helpless, and I am not alone." Their suitcases were half-packed upstairs. They left within the hour. Ashley's sunglasses back on, Liam's face tight with words he couldn't form. I closed the door behind them, leaned my forehead against the wood, and breathed. For the first time in months, the house felt like mine again. 2 days later, as I swept the front steps the way Frank always liked, clean from edge to edge so the mailman wouldn't trip, the phone rang. It was the pawn shop clerk, his voice lighter this time. "Mrs. Price, the sale fell through. The buyer's funds didn't clear. If you can come in today, we can make it right." For a moment I couldn't move. Then I set the broom aside, pulled on my coat, and drove to Maple Avenue with a cashier's check folded neatly in my purse. The bell over the door chimed just as it had before, but this time the sound didn't sting. The clerk set the Rolex on a square of black felt, stepping back as though he were handing me something sacred. The watch looked unchanged, sleek, strong, a little scuffed from years of wear, but I felt the weight of it differently. It wasn't only Frank's, it was mine now, a tether I had fought to reclaim. I wiped away a faint smudge with my sleeve and forgave what fingerprints I could. The clerk hesitated, then lifted the original presentation box. "You should know," he said. "There's a secondary compartment under the lining, usually meant for extra links. This one seemed deliberate." He handed me a tiny jeweler's key. My pulse hammered as I fit it into the hidden seam. With a soft click, a panel slid open. Inside lay a micro SD card in a plastic sleeve and a folded scrap of paper in Frank's blocky handwriting. "If you're here, you need this." Back at Lawson's office, we slid the card into a reader. The screen filled with Frank's quiet insurance policy, scans of casino markers, call logs to loan sharks, recordings from our doorbell camera, Ashley rehearsing lies about my mental state, Liam bragging to a friend that he had a plan once I got too prickly. There were also softer files, photos of me on the porch with a book, the dog curled at my feet, snapshots of a life Frank had wanted to preserve. Lawson burned a copy. "Miss," Patel added the evidence to her case file. "This isn't for revenge," she reminded me. "This is for protection." I nodded, grateful for her bluntness. That evening, I placed the watch on my wrist for the first time. The band was slightly loose, the tick steady, the face catching the kitchen light like Frank's wink across a crowded room. It didn't erase betrayal or grief, but it reminded me that some promises outlive their keepers. a week later. Liam called from an unfamiliar number. His voice was cracked, desperate. The casino had cut him off. Ashley was gone, and he didn't know what to do. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, the words ragged. "I'll help you find help," I told him, "but I won't give you money." He was silent a long time. "You love me less," he finally whispered. "I love you exactly," I said, "and that's why I won't feed what's destroying you." He hung up, but in the morning I sent him numbers for a counselor and a support group that met in the church basement. I wrote his name on my calendar, like an appointment with hope. When Miss Patel later confirmed the petition had been withdrawn, I sat on the porch steps and let the sun warm my knees. The house behind me stood steady. The watch ticked at my wrist, and I whispered Frank's favorite words, "Easy does it, L." One step at a time. Mornings in the house feel different now. I brew tea, feed the dog, and listen to the grandfather clock in the hallway. People like to say time heals, but I've learned that isn't quite right. Time doesn't erase the hurt. It stacks it beside grocery lists, doctor's appointments, and small joys until the weight starts to balance. Healing is less about forgetting and more about learning how to carry it all without dropping what still matters. Liam has started showing up at the church basement meetings. He misses some, then goes back, shaky but trying. When he comes to the house, he drinks decaf at my table and tells me what he's learning about himself. Sometimes his eyes shine with shame, and I look away to give him the space to speak without judgment. He hasn't asked me for money again. He's asked me for patience, and that I can give. Ashley sent me a letter on heavy cream paper. She apologized for overstepping. Her word, not mine. People often apologize for the part of the truth they can handle. I wrote back that I wished her better, nothing more. No anger, no blessing, just that. She has moved out of Liam's life, and maybe out of mine. That, too, is something time will decide. At the pawn shop, I stop by occasionally, bringing the clerk a box of cinnamon rolls from the bakery down the block. He tells me business is steady, that emergencies never go out of fashion. When he looks at me, I know he remembers what that watch meant. Sometimes, he says, people do come back for what matters. When the Children's Hospital unveiled the new wing, Frank's name gleamed on the plaque by the entrance. I stood there with my hand on the letters, thinking how tidy the screws looked, how proud he would have been. It wasn't a fortune compared to the world's wealth, but it was everything he could leave, transformed into something that would outlast us both. At night, when the house is quiet and the dog snores at my feet, I slip off the Rolex and set it under the lamp. Its steady tick fills the room like a heartbeat that refuses to fade. My name is Eleanor Price. I am a widow, a mother, and a woman who learned that quiet isn't surrender, it's strategy. I loved a man who believed in tightening bolts and labeling envelopes. I loved a son who lost his way but is fighting to find it. And I am still here, living in the house we built, wearing the proof that love, when prepared, can outlast betrayal. If you ever hear the click of a hidden compartment in your own life, don't be afraid. Sometimes it's not a trap. Sometimes it's a hand reaching forward, passing you the tools to make the world honest again. And that, I've discovered, is enough to keep the tick steady in your chest. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these family drama and revenge stories, please subscribe and join me for more every day.